one of our goals with Assassin's Creed 3 was to sort of rebuild the franchise from its core. Even though Assassin's Creed is published every year, it's not developed year by year.
Assassin's Creed 3 started in January 2010, where basically a bunch of people coming out of AC2, like AC2 just shipped in November, so they decided to try to explore different ideas, different period as well.
Right when we started, we knew this game had to be a fresh new entry in the franchise and be ambitious and kind of reinvent everything.
We knew this had to be the same kind of jump from AC1 to AC2. For AC2 to AC3. We know the core of Assassin's Creed. It's the combat, the free-running, social stealth. By keeping an eye on those three things, those three pillars of our gameplay, we could bring the gameplay down to a very sort of basic level and then build it back up again with a lot of new stuff, a lot of new ingredients for the player, different ways of playing.
The way we organized the ramp up of AC3 is to have most of the core team from AC2 to jump in AC3. And at that time, it was just the start of AC Brotherhood.
And at that stage, there was about 11 or 12 of us, and for the first sort of 6 months, it was probably under 30 people. And we were just talking basically about where it should be set, what time period would work, who our heroes should be. The first two things we decided that we thought would work, one was the idea of the American Revolution, and the second was the idea of a Native American hero. So what we tried to do was build it almost like a pyramid, an inverse pyramid, where you start with these big core decisions, and really you have to stick with them and then work it out from there.
The American Revolution, a lot of the ideas and themes behind it dovetail really nicely with the themes behind the Templar-Assassin conflict. We've had this, millennia-old struggle of free will, versus oppression. The idea that the Templars want to impose their version of the world upon people and sort of control them in that manner. And I think you can draw a parallel in that a lot of patriots may have felt that this is what the Loyalists were trying to do, that they wanted to take the British system and impose it upon these colonies in the Americas. And a lot of people started to resist that idea, this idea of like people that are far away who think they know better are trying to tell me what to do and how to live my life.
I like the fact that when we announced the setting that it was going to be the American Revolution, that people were surprised and were asking how could this work, how would it function, because that meant we had somewhere fresh. And that was really our first goal, was to make sure that it was an unexpected place to set a game, that it was somewhere a game hadn't been set before, and somewhere where we could hopefully do some new stuff. When you have a very small team, before you have a lot of engineers or you have a lot of content creators, you still want to draw a picture for people, something better than a document. So we build a video, a little movie, it's a couple of minutes long, and it tries to be as real as possible. No assets that you couldn't use in the real game. The camera's in the same position that we want the camera to be in the final game. Any weapons you use are ideas we have for gameplay, as systemic and believable as possible.
The target gameplay footage is really critical for just setting, this is what we're aiming for. It gives us basically a living, visible prototype. These are the people I'm going to see, the kinds of enemies I'll meet, the experience that I want to have for the player. We take that video and we can basically just break that down into a series of different features, right? The things that I'm going to need to be able to give to the coders and the animators and the world team, the sound guys, and say, okay, to execute this, here's the list of things, the features that I need to be able to create this game.
Like any project, we start with ideas, and then first thing you want to do is prototype key ideas or the most risky ideas.
We need to have risk to be lowered right from the start. Like the tree navigation, we need to know early on that it works. The naval battle, we need to know early on that it works.
On the engine side and on the gameplay side, we have very little at this point. We'll have essentially these test environments where you have, for us it's just like an orange ground texture that has a black grid on it that tells you how far apart things are. And then inside of that, we'll test absolutely everything and do quick prototypes to try out some ideas, see what works, see what doesn't work, decide whether a feature is good enough to use and good enough to build and is going to be fun before we commit to the full-on development of it. So with that came a lot of new engine technologies, and to the extent that we consider it essentially a completely new engine.
We decided to build a new engine for Assassin's Creed 3 based purely on gameplay. So obviously the hardware hasn't changed. We didn't suddenly find 80 mega RAM that was hidden away in the 360 or the PS3, but we're able to say, if we were going to build an engine that enabled us to create new content, what would happen?
So Anvil Next is the next major iteration of the Assassin's Creed engine. The Frontier is the #1 motivation to do Anvil Next in the beginning. So the first thing we tried was, can we make a forest that looks good but still works with a decent frame rate and is still readable from a gameplay point of view. We also prototype stuff like the Deep Snow came with deformable tracks. In previous games we had water, but it was always like a straight delimitation between water and ground. Now it's progressive beaches, so what do we do with fighting in that thing with knee-deep snow, knee-deep water, animals mixed with that? So it all came from the first prototypes. So another big challenge that came pretty quickly was the number of NPCs on screen, both for battlefields and from cities like New York. We thought we can cheat and block people's line of sight so they don't see as far. But in the end, because of the battlefields, we also had another reason to develop a new tech that now enables us to render over 2,000 NPCs at once. And we use the same tech to solve both problems. We didn't find all the answers back then, but we found a lot of questions that we had to answer. It took maybe a year and a half to finally say, yeah, I think we have a recipe, we have a good idea, we think we're gonna make it.
Coming up with how Connor looked, I think, was one of the hardest things we had to do in the game.
Connor is our main hero. He's half Native American, half British. He was raised by the Mohawk tribes.
He's a lot stronger than the previous assassins. This assassin like bludgeons and he beats up and he breaks arms and legs. You'll see the pain on the enemy's faces when he's taking them out.
We wanted a character who was noble, who was out to fight against injustice wherever he saw it.
Connor is our latest protagonist in the Assassin's Creed franchise, at least in the past portion of the game. He is of mixed ethnicity. He has a mother that is of Kanien'kehá:ka origin and a father that is of European descent.
Connor is really someone who's different to Altair, who was driven by duty. It was his job to be an assassin. He's different from Ezio, who was driven by revenge. We wanted a character who was noble, who was out to fight against injustice wherever he saw it, instead of just personal revenge or just because it was a task he had to pursue.
Connor's got this very strong ideology, and he believes, much as the assassins do, is that all people should be free to sort of forge their own path through life. He is opposed to those that oppress, that terrorize, that would seek to impose their view of the world on others. And so that could be anything from, colonials to potentially other people that he lives with. He is at least initially intrigued by the message of the American Revolution, although he certainly never declares himself a patriot or joins the Patriot Army or anything like that. He just happens to see people that are fighting for what he believes to be the same core values that he holds.
We wanted it to be muddy. We wanted him to be often confused about whether what he was doing was the right thing. We wanted the world to get in the way, but really for events not to play out the way he expected.
He sees the world as being very black and white. There is a clearly defined good and evil out there, or so he at least initially believes. And so this is sort of the guy that you take control of and come into his life at a fairly early age and then follow him for several decades as he grows and matures and learns the meaning of things like compromise and balance and shades of gray.
Connor was raised by the Mohawk Nation. We really felt that we want to honor that nation. And for that, we want to have someone that came from Native origins as an actor. The performance for Connor needed to be calm, but at the same time, you had to feel that he could get really angry for things that he felt were just, and it had to be just in his voice.
Simple seems a bit charitable.
Cheer up, Connor. For tonight, we are all victors.
Coming up with how Connor looked, I think, was one of the hardest things we had to do in the game. We knew we wanted him to be Native American, but what does that mean? We have an 18th century, setting, we have Native American as an idea, and we have this sort of very iconic assassin's costume. And we felt that if we went completely period, we would lose this unique quality that the assassin has. We can put an assassin on a poster and many gamers can immediately identify him, even if it's a different flavor. But at the same time, we didn't want him to just stick out like a sore thumb. So the way we approached it in the end was this idea that being an assassin is almost a job. You go to that job and you wear the uniform of that job, and that's the assassin's hood. That said, he would then customize it. He would go back and touch it up and bring his own personality to it.
Trying to make a new assassin, it's an abstract challenge. You've got to try and make it the same character, but Connor's different from Ezio and Altair, so we tried to get in a bit of his personality, and that was the big challenge there, was trying to make it the same but different. When we started working on him, it was like the previous assassins, where they were kind of smaller guys in lots of armor, and the more we worked with Connor, we wanted to make him heavier and stronger. We found that we kept working with the silhouette to make him good from all angles. If you don't have a good silhouette on a character, then the animation just will never look good. And we kept stripping things away and found out that he became bulkier and bulkier, so he's a lot stronger than the previous assassins, and that really informed a lot of the way he jumps. So he uses a lot of effort. He's no longer just gracefully sailing through the sky like a swan.
A lot of the improvements are in the animation section. There's rarely an animation playing on Connor that is not procedurally deformed with foot placement or inverse kinematic, and lots of techniques that we use to make it more realistic, more grounded in the environment.
Because we were using a lot of procedural stuff on top of the animation, we have a layer of physics on top of the assassin all the time. We went to mocap, and we would actually capture an actor running around, shifting his weight, changing his balance, putting his feet different places, and then we just take that and be able to use it as reference and then animate it and try and recreate it with programs.
We want to have animations that are responsive, so that if you press a button, you want to have it happen really fast. You don't want to have to wait for the nice motion of the guy coming in and swinging. Our animators, they go in, they decide, okay, this is going to be our enter frame, and they decide at which points they can exit, at which point they can use a counter. So we really break down our animations into multiple small animations that can then be adjusted for gameplay with our programmers.
We wanted the combat in AC3 to be more brutal than it was before. We wanted it to be rougher. I think anytime you have a war setting, it is by definition a little more brutal. And we also felt that the setting itself was a little dirtier. You know what I mean? Like, lots of the story of the American Revolution is the story of people versus the elements, or people versus armies, or people versus hunger. And we wanted that to come through even in the fighting style.
Whereas previous assassins they'd stab. This assassin bludgeons and he beats up and he breaks arms and legs. Because he's stronger, he can lift characters up, so we put in a lot of wrestling moves in there as well. We basically threw out the old fight system, started again from scratch, so a lot of the controls have changed, and we managed to keep it really fluid though. You can counter at any stage, and we cover all different distances.
For us, we wanted to create more strategy, more options, more ways of challenging the player. So we settled on this scheme where instead of using the right trigger to counter, you would tap B. It would start a counter, but you would have to choose on the face buttons how to finish that counter. So you can hit B again and you'll just throw the guy. You can hit A and you'll stun him, disarm him, hit X and you'll kill him, hit Y and you'll use your tool. So with that, we can create enemies that'll resist any of those moves. We can challenge you to basically take a different approach on each enemy archetype that you come against.
Connor himself is a dual-wielding specialist. He's always using two weapons at the same time. It allows for a beautiful animation. It also allows for more fluidity in the player response.
We found that it was really nice to always have the knife. You can always have the knife and a sword, or a knife and a tomahawk, and a knife and the other hidden blade. It made us able to do a lot more fast moves, directional things. One thing that was cool though is facial expressions, and that really adds a lot. We bring in the camera close and you'll see Connor's effort, and you'll see the pain on the enemy's faces when he's taking them out.
With combo killing, we looked at it and we basically just said, hey, we want this to be really generous, but only if you have the right strategy for attacking people. You can chain your kills in between people, and you kill one person, move to the next, and move to the next. But the enemies, we wanted them to be able to interrupt you in the middle of that. We want them to be able to defend themselves from that. We want the player to have to choose the correct approach against a different enemy archetype to defeat them. So we're bringing the same sort of model of choose the correct face button to continue your kill streak.
Hopefully, in the end, we've delivered a really well-rounded, believable character who, you have mixed feelings about throughout the game. At the end, you love him, but I'm also hoping that for once in a game, you have moments where you understand his conflict with other characters.
That decision to do the Frontier affected absolutely everything. It's almost a 2K by 2K world.
We spent a long time looking at rock climbing and different handholds that you have to use.
We really wanted to show off and do a lot with the animals, not just about navigation and reactions.
To execute the tree running was one of our biggest challenges. That effort alone took so many people, so much time to get right.
We didn't want it to look like Tarzan. We wanted the forest to look real.
When we were looking at the American Revolution, we wanted to make sure that players were going to experience the full scope of life in this era. And obviously this is a new frontier for people. This is where humanity is extending out into this vast unknown world, unknown to Europeans. And we wanted to be able to translate that experience and give that to you when you were playing it. We could have taken the choice of just being restricted to the cities, but I think we would have been missing out on a huge amount of what it means to live in this era, in this location.
Games are often built on straight lines and rules, and nature has very few straight lines and not many, rules on the level of sort of visual shapes and sizes. There's no boxes, there's no perfectly flat surfaces often.
With a city, you can almost consider unfolding it, right? And it becomes a flat terrain, right? It's a much less complicated problem than a forest where you have a fully 3D environment, where you have terrain everywhere and then things going up, branches, beams coming out of them, and a lot of choice about where you can go at any given time.
The world team itself is built up of level artists and level designers. Their goal is to make a beautiful and believable and functional play space, to take the concept of the frontier and to rebuild that and include all the kind of features that you'd expect, streams and cliffs and forests, and then leave enough room for the gameplay. And then when the mission designer comes through after that and builds their mission on top of that, then there's a negotiation process. So they will roughly position it and then go back to the world team and say, hey, you know what would make this mission even better if I could get, a bunch of wolves here, or if this slope was steeper, or if there was a dense forest I had to move through as part of this mission. And it goes back and forth several times to try and really tighten that mission and deliver the best possible experience.
Creating the Frontier map, which is by far the biggest map we've ever created. It's a completely different style of terrain. We were forced to really reevaluate how we do everything about our navigation systems, our stealth systems, and even the combat was drastically affected by this. When you have the kind of fight system we have where we expect to see connection between your weapons, when I block, I want it to actually connect. Doing that on an undulating terrain was an enormous technical challenge for us.
When we added on top the seasons, winter was another challenge, or the change between summer and winter would had to disappear during winter or appear during winter, like the tall grass, for example. So you remove the grass, add the snow. Snow had to be deformable, and we wanted the tracks that people make and animals make in the snow to be remembered. Even if you go a bit further and you come back, the tracks will still be there, so that was a challenge.
When we realized that we wanted to have an assassin who was as capable in the wilderness as previous assassins had been in cities, we realized it was a huge challenge. We didn't want it to look like Tarzan, and we didn't want it to look like Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, for example. We wanted it to be believable and tactile, and we wanted the forest to look real.
The number of trees and branches to display, any developer could tell you that the leaves and transparency is always costly on the GPU, so a forest obviously was a big problem, so we had to adapt the whole rendering engine to be able to display a forest.
To execute the tree running was one of our biggest challenges. Usually when you see a forest in a video game, it's just an obstacle. There are things that are in your way and they're going to stop you moving through, and that's it. For us, it's a playground. Just take a few steps here, you'll be jumping up into this thing, and then you'll be just experiencing a whole new navigation that you've never had before.
Navigation is probably the strongest pillar of the Assassin's Creed franchise. It's always been beautiful and easy to use and allowed us to traverse all kinds of crazy environments. But when we took it to the forest, we had a whole new set of challenges. Trees are often not flat, they're V-shapes, all these unusual degrees of separation and distances. So instead, for example, of every tree needing to be 8 feet high, because that was how high the animation was, we built a system where basically it could be anywhere from 6 to 10 and the animation would work around it. And we did that for all kinds of things, moving between how wide the angle was on the V-shapes within trees, how broad the branches were, how far apart they were. And luckily, once you get all of those together and position them in the world within many different degrees of those ranges, you start to get a more natural, believable landscape. We felt that stealth was one of the underutilized features in the game. It became more and more combat and navigation focused. And while we know that we don't want to force people to play super stealthily, we want to give people more options. So we built some features in the game such as tall grass or bushes that are mobile hide spots that you can move through and remain hidden, so you can sneak up on enemies from a distance.
When you're up in the trees, you're much less detectable than you are on the ground.
We wanted sort of a layer, a branch layer within the forest where you could be above your enemies, assassinating from above. We built some new tools, such as the rope dart, which allow you to kill silently and create distractions. We have sort of traps in this game, which we built originally for animals, the idea of trapping and snaring animals in the frontier, but they're also useful against people. So we tried as much as possible to sort of extend the toolkit for players in terms of stealth.
For the animals of Assassin's Creed 3, we decided we wanted to create a hunting system and allow you to be able to go after the animals and hunt them. But I wanted more than just sort of reactive hunting. Typically when you see animals in a video game, it's just, oh, there's an animal, okay, I'm gonna kill him, and that's my choice. That's the extent of it. I wanted to be able to bring a sense of tracking animals. If an animal comes along and marks its territory, bears like scratch their back on trees, they do all sorts of crazy stuff. You can analyze the signs, see the footprints, and say, okay, there's an animal over here somewhere, I'm gonna go chase after him.
Yeah, man.
One of the goals was to turn the crowd life of the game into the wildlife, and it was a fun challenge because you can't motion capture animals, so we had to keyframe and animate every single thing. Obviously we used video reference, but we went out to wildlife centres and filmed the animals, just watched them. You can't see them running around, so we used videos for that, but we got the details and like little ear movements, the way they'll shift their weight, how heavy a bear is. When it turns around, it's constantly like putting its weight on each leg.
We created the hunting map as well, which is basically an overlay on the game map where it breaks up the frontier into various different regions, and you can see what animals you've discovered in each region. So if you're looking for a particularly rare or difficult to find animal, you'll have a much better clue of the areas that you can discard because you've already fully explored them. So, okay, I'm gonna have to check up in this corner over here to see if there's a bobcat hanging around over there. I wanted to be able to bring some of that sort of National Geographic life of animals to players inside of the game and show them a lot of the behaviors and activities that animals get up to in this environment.
We really wanted to show off and do a lot with the animals, not just about navigation and reactions. We wanted to have these specific little magical moments that you'll find throughout the game in AC3.
I think we have over 20 different animals that you can interact with. You don't just go and look at them or kill them. Because the wilderness is kind of empty, if it's just trees and bushes, you want to be able to have this emptiness and then occasionally happen upon a deer or happen upon a bear and get into a fight. And it's up to you what you want to do with animals. You can scare them away, you can kill them, or you can just watch them.
I'm very proud of what we achieved, especially with the wilderness. I remember 3 years ago, we weren't sure at all if we were going to be able to pull it off. And today the frontier is massive, it's rich in details, it looks beautiful, and it works.
For Assassin's Creed, history is our playground.
All of the historical people and events are recreated as they are in a history book or in a documentary, but you, the assassin, are this sort of vein of fiction running through the middle.
Boston's 1-to-3 scale. It's huge, the time it takes for a player to walk from here to the end of the neck.
Aim, and then turn your head, because when you pull the trigger, this blows up and would burn your face.
The revolution would not have succeeded without Navy.
The office tagline is "History is our playground," and we take it very, very seriously. We do a lot of research. We have historical advisors on staff. We try as much as possible to put anything that's objective, so a costume or a building or an event, to have it play out as accurately as possible. But obviously it's really just a background for our story. It's the backdrop that we set our game inside, so we build a fictional narrative that runs through it. So we try to say all of the historical people and events are recreated as they are in a history book or in a documentary, but you, the assassin, are this sort of vein of fiction, this made-up story running through the middle.
We started in the time before the revolution and went into a couple of years after its conclusion so that we had a wide space to play in. We tried to choose moments that were familiar to people, that would resonate, and then a couple of moments that might be new to them, so that we have this balance of something where players can say, oh, I've learned about this, I've read about this, it's really kind of neat to see it from this perspective, and then other events that may not be as familiar where they can feel like, oh, I'm learning something new, I'm being exposed to some interesting new historical information, new experiences.
All of our targets in any Assassin's Creed game actually have been real historical people. They always die at the right time, or the right year at least, in the right place. But how they die obviously is up to the player.
When I first came on the project, it was about 2.5 years ago, and right at the beginning, and that was kind of my first job, was to, like, just start collecting information and see who was around, who these people were, what they were doing, trying to find events that might be, pertinent to an Assassin's versus Templar story. For us on the writing team, it's all about language and people and events and kind of the chronology of things and the motivations behind a lot of these men and what they were doing and the reasons for the events that they were involved in. Surprisingly, a lot of them weren't quite as noble as you might think they were. A lot of people, men, particularly in the colonial army, were fighting because it was something to do. They didn't really have a dog in the fight. They didn't really know what it was about, but they were promised 3 square meals a day and to see the colonies, and that was better than, working on the farm.
In terms of dialogue for historical characters, if we stuck 100% to how people spoke and behaved back then, cutscenes would go on forever, and people would probably have difficulty in certain cases following what characters were saying.
Bollocks, we're coming in!
We have several dictionaries that were written around the time of slang and what they call the vulgar tongue, so we were able to work in certain things that are a little bit more casual, a little bit more period specific. It might sound like gibberish to a lot of people because these are phrases that have definitely fallen out of favor.
3 pence a pound is hardly burthensome.
Choosing the cities in the game was a matter of answering multiple prerequisites. People were hoping for different events to happen in the game. For instance, the Boston Massacre was a must, but also the team wanted to have different events that we would bring back to light that people wouldn't know as much, and some of the events that also would fit more into our fantasy. The first time the player will get to Boston is eventually through the Long Wharf. It was something that we really wanted to do from the beginning. It feels like that's how you enter the New World if you come from Europe. A couple hills that were there back then. Fort Hill over here, the Common on top, and the North Ward, and then Tremont, which were the 3 hills that were in Boston. This place is still called Tremont today because of the 3 mountains over there. Most popular was certainly Beacon Hill because people would use the beacon as a warning in case of any attacks. Unfortunately, had to cut some parts. One was Philadelphia. Actually, there are still parts we'll use in the game, but the city as a whole was a bit problematic. Landmarks were cool, but not sufficient to make this city really interesting as a gameplay purpose. And also technically, the fact that it was a grid, that streets were really linear, it was really hard for the loading, so we had to cut it off.
I think in terms of tone, all of the colonial cities we built are much more wooden than previous Assassin's Creed cities, which were often stone. The steepled roofs have a big impact on free running. There's a lot more nature in the cities than ever before, so there's often trees and larger squares. The streets themselves are wider.
For the first time in the series, we have a lot of slopes, like in the Frontier as well, but on the roofs there's a lot of slopes there. So that really meant that you could get into fights on rooftops that were really steep slopes. We had to spend a long time in the fight system, in just general navigation, like every single step the assassin takes, he has to place it correctly. We take a lot of the moves that we created for Frontier, because obviously that was the one that really pushed us most, and we bring it back into the cities as well. So you can do a lot of these cool things, but the one favourite that we do have is the ability to run through buildings. We call it the pass through because we've added moves called the pass over, so now you can jump over things, you can slide underneath things, and you can run through buildings as well. And it's really cinematic and it feels pretty awesome. It's over in a flash, but it's a great way of getting past people. And you'll have like a woman in the window and she gets scared as you run past, and it's pretty cool.
One of the scary things in moving to America from Europe was we had to rebuild all of our civilian population. These are characters that players often don't look at in great detail, but there are hundreds of them and many different flavors of them. You really need them to fill out your city locations. And we wanted to give them more specificity, more things to do, so our civilians can start and stop actions. Some of them are people who can give you missions you could come across. We wanted the civilians themselves to be sources of content.
Leave the tea to rot aboard those foul ships!
When history delivers something in the period we're dealing with, we can't really ignore it. And we knew that guns had become much more present in the American Revolution than they were in previous Assassin's Creed settings.
Picture being on a battlefield. When you pull the trigger on one of these bad boys, it would smoke like you wouldn't believe. So the smoke on the field was insane. Even the recreations today where they fire black powder, they only use a quarter to a half what they actually use, so the smoke isn't even really what it really was. So anyway, you're sitting there, the guys are marching at you, you're nervous, you're scared, your gun's searing hot because you've shot it already a few times. You gotta half cock it, You gotta reach in your pocket, put some black powder in here, put this back, and you gotta go down here. You gotta drop your wadding in, then drop your ball, then drop some more black powder. And you gotta pull this thing out. Meanwhile, there's guys probably shooting at you. You gotta flip it over. You gotta stuff it like this. You gotta pull that out. This is searing hot, so your hand's burning because you already shot your gun a few times. So you're probably holding it here. You gotta jam this back down, and you gotta pick it up, see through all the smoke who you're gonna shoot at, aim, and then turn your head, because when you pull the trigger, this blows up and would burn your face. You gotta aim, then turn your head away and shoot. These guns have no rifling, and you're shooting a little ball, so they're already really, really inaccurate, and they're very heavy, and your hands are burnt, and it's the madhouse. So, I mean, you just imagine how inaccurate they actually would be. And when people talk about, you know, there was guns in those periods, it's so stupid the assassin couldn't get to them, just think of all of that when you think about what it took to shoot one of these things. And it's really easy to get to somebody in that time and take them out with a knife or a sword.
When we started thinking about the American Revolution as a setting, we realized the battles that happened, the events inside of the cities, the events in the frontier, those were all obviously critical to the revolution and exactly what we wanted to create inside of our game. But when we opened up the history books a little bit more deeply, you know, it became apparent really quickly the revolution would not have succeeded without navies. The British Navy was critical in their dominance in the empire that they created. We knew we had to go there. We had to try it, at least as a prototype, to see if we could get something going. Pretty quickly we were convinced that this was going to be something awesome, so we just staffed up a full-on team in Singapore to focus on this. As we went forwards, every iteration that we saw just got better and better. We developed this tech where you can go from a calm, glassy sea to absolutely huge raging storms, massive waves all over the place dynamically, like on the fly. When we saw that we were going to have these kinds of potentials, we knew it was going to be absolutely huge for us.
I have worked on games in the past where there was quite a bit of direction change, and this time there was almost none. We've really stuck to the initial vision. What we're delivering is pretty much exactly what we set out to deliver.
It's a long development cycle. You know, the joke, a lot of us who've been on it 3 years, we could have become veterinarians if, you know, in the same amount of time, and instead we made this game. And it's a huge chunk of your working life to put into something.
3 years ago, I couldn't imagine working on a game the size of this. It has depth and detail in so many different ways, from the microcosmic view of the homestead where you see what it's like to be a lumberjack in the American Revolution, to the sweeping, huge naval battles that you'll be inside of, and the cities where you'll see a whole new set of life, to the frontier where you'll be climbing on cliffs and running through the trees and watching wolves eating deer. To have the honor and privilege to work on this kind of thing, for me, is just spectacular.